Good afternoon. We are delighted that you joined us this afternoon. There's a quotation that I often like to use before beginning many sessions, and it goes a little like this. People hate each other because they fear each other. They fear each other because they don't know each other, and they don't know each other because they are so often separated one from another. Dr. King said that back in 1966, and it is as though he could have said it yesterday. And as we, as in the Academy, have been studying these issues related to prejudice, stereotypes, and human behavior, we've tried to answer his question about why it is that we are so often separated one from another. And I think that the current work on implicit bias gives us an exciting new way to come to understand the divisions between and among us. What you saw on the board, we are not going to give you tests on what you saw on the board, by the way. Just, I saw some of you were getting a little nervous and writing furiously. That was supposed to be environment. But, but what we hope to do today is really engage the panel and even perhaps a little bit of you in this idea of what, not only a definition of implicit bias, but how it works and how it impacts our lives. And especially given what I know will come out on this panel are the lives of women. Not only the lives of women at this university, women in this country, women in the world. We have three very exciting presenters, and they just talked me out of reading their long and wonderful bios from the book. And so instead, I'm going to begin, as I frequently do in groups, for those of you who've had the misfortune of being in groups with me, where I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves and answer a question. And so after they introduce themselves one by one, I'm going to ask them, so what is your relationship to this topic? What is your relationship to implicit bias, and why is it so important to you? So, starting immediately to my right.
I hate going after Terry. She's such a tough act to follow. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Claire Bruno. I am currently the Director of Graduate Admissions here at VSB. Prior to joining VSB, I spent 5 years at the Wharton School, also in an admissions capacity. Prior to that, the Fox School of Business, and then I was in undergraduate admissions. So a lot of my exposure to implicit bias comes around evaluation, recruitment, meeting people, and also interpreting my own institution's implicit bias, or the perception that people have of the institution that you work for and how I represent it. Specifically, when you work in higher education, it's a very female-dominated environment, and so depending on the institution that you work for and the reputation that they have and people's perception of that role and that institution, it's given me a lot of exposure not only to implicit bias in itself, but how I need to combat it daily as I look to evaluate students and their fit for the program. So that's just, my role is probably the most obvious with how implicit bias interacts with my professional responsibilities.
So Arante, how did you come to? I mean, stranger in the middle, how did you come to?
So my name is Arante Bennett, and I am a associate professor of it happened years ago. I don't know why I just said that. Sorry, literally years ago. Of marketing here. I'm also our associate department chair, and so my interaction with bias is kind of twofold. I face it in the classroom, so as a professor that's a woman and of color, there's always a concern about how I'm being received and perceived. As a faculty member, I must be mindful of my own biases as I evaluate students, and keeping those at bay is instrumental to ensuring a fair and equitable system for all of my students. But now in my administrative capacity as associate chair, I'm mindful of my faculty and their progression through the ranks and their experiences here in VSB. And implicit bias comes to bear in all of those places and rooms.
The other Terry?
Bookending Terry.
Why and I?
We're already a good pair.
Why and I?
Exactly. So I'm Terry Boyer, for those of you who don't know me. I'm the founding director of the Ann Welsh McNulty Institute for Women's Leadership, and I was really excited to be on this panel because for me, as a white woman who was often doing equity training for decades with other white professionals, mostly teachers and educators, I was always so frustrated because people would say, oh, well, you know, these sorts of the sorts of discrimination that you talk about historically don't really exist anymore, and it's these subtle things. And when I finally learned about implicit bias and started using it in my trainings, it was like that aha moment that put a name and science behind those subtle things that people used as the excuse for what doesn't happen anymore in terms of discrimination or bias. And so it was a really great both aha moment for me to be able to put a name to it and put science behind it, and then use that as a tool for training and equity in the long term for the work that I did. And yeah, I think, yeah, we'll get into other questions in a minute.
Oh, indeed. You know what, Arante, I really would like to go back to you because I think that certainly that's one thing we all have in common is the teaching and the research enterprise. So I guess I would like to ask you specifically, how does implicit bias impact you in the classroom, in the daily practice of teaching?
So I'm always mindful that every student comes to class with their own background and their own experiences. And I can't foresee what those are going to be. But I am aware that there are these cultural expectations and understandings of women, of faculty, and of Black people. And as a combination, I'm mindful of what that means to my students. But in general, as faculty, we know that women are systematically given lower evaluations. There's a recent study out that says that when you randomly assign students to class with either a male or a female faculty member, that the students even though their grades aren't affected, nor is their self-reported study time affected, the female faculty member is always evaluated lower, as are non-academic components of the class. The textbook and even the online learning system are evaluated more or less favorably if the person in front of the class is a woman, right? And so just being female changes the way I'm viewed, and that extends to other components of my job. My service expectations are different as a woman. So even though no one sets out to say women serve more in the business school, they implicitly expect that I'll be the note taker, that I'll arrive to all the service activities. And these things in combination just make for a harder rise through the ranks.
If I may, how do you push back on that and still get tenured?
I have a personal ability to say no. It's not a thing I shy away from. I accept responsibility. I'm happy to be of service. But at which point it becomes a detriment to my research or teaching, then I will kindly request a reprieve. Dean Russell might remind us of, just very recently, we had a discussion about my concerns about my service activities. And I wanted to be mindful of my goal to meet my next professional milestone. And though I want to be of service to the department and to the school, I have to be able to weigh them both evenly and not sacrifice my professional development in order to serve.
So much more to ask, but I want to get the other first statements in. Terry, I think one of the things that Arante has brought up is the differential treatment of women. So the concepts of woman and leader both hold, we have to admit, strong biases in this culture. So how do you see unconscious bias really influencing women's leadership? And I have a follow-up. So why don't I ask them both, and then you can hit them both. Okay. So then how will the McNulty Institute obviously work to, little question, work to advance women's leadership given that particular context?
So just as you said, there are really powerful perceptions that immediately happen when we say the term woman and when we say the term leader. And those perceptions are often at odds with each other, right? And I would do an exercise in a lot of the trainings that I did on women's leadership, where I have my students Google image search woman, and then Google image search leader, and make comparisons of what that looks like. Now, those of you who don't know how Google works, right, it's an algorithm, and the things that pop up at the top of the list are the things that others have selected as most relevant to the topic they're searching for, right? So it's not necessarily a scientific base, but it is a way to look at where people are choosing things that match that term. And what you find is that, you know, leader looks really different than woman, right? And that there's not a lot of cross in those two image searches. And that's, I think, a good representation of how we have this immediate bias as to what a woman should be and what a leader should be. And they're really powerful. You know, when I used to do trainings, and those of us of a certain age may remember this, there was an old Saturday Night Live skit, and comedy is so often a good way to help us understand ourselves as humans. There was this old Saturday Night Live skit called It's Pat, and those of you who might remember it, there was a character whose name was Pat, whose gender was hard for people to determine. In fact, the big mystery was, I don't think it was ever revealed, right, over these series. And you watched as people became more and more frustrated by not knowing whether Pat was a woman or a man. And they got to the point where they literally couldn't interact with this character because they didn't know how to do it without knowing whether it was a woman or a man. And that to me was a perfect illustration of how strong and how guiding implicit bias is, because we use it as a cognitive tool to help us understand how to interact, which is ridiculous, right? But at the same time, when we don't know, we get stuck on these things. So I think that what we need to do is build awareness of what it means when we say woman and what those biases are immediately that come there, and how or not the leader fits with that. And then change the definition of leader to meet what we think of as woman. Because, and this was said in an earlier panel, the Dean's panel, where we often think of women's leadership from this deficit perspective, like that it doesn't exist or we don't have enough women leaders out there. But in reality, a lot of what women are doing are leadership activities, but we don't name it as such because of those biases for leader and woman. And if the McNulty Institute can help bring those two things together in the dialogue that happens on this campus, both with our students, but also with our faculty and staff and alumni, then I think I'll feel good about some of the work that we can do, at least to start off.
And you know what's interesting, and you would expect this to come to me, oftentimes when we should talk about the intersectional issue here, because oftentimes when we hear the word woman, let's think about what image do we get, you know, and I would say that probably my face is not a face that is one that comes up. So can you talk a little bit about both how race sort of intersects with the role of women, and how the McNulty Institute, because I know we've talked about this, will start to address some of those
And Terry's
issues.
given me a softball here, because this is something that she knows that I'm really interested in making sure happens, and that is when we tend to think of women's leadership. So even, okay, we have woman, we have leader, and then we have a whole perception of women's leadership, right, which brings a whole host of thoughts or biases about what that looks like. And as Terry's alluding to, it's often considered to be this kind of bastion of white feminism, right? So when we say women's leadership, we often tend to think of that's where the white feminists are, but there's even the term feminist, right, has a lot of pieces to it, right? And so when we think about woman, we need to immediately make sure that we are being inclusive of everyone who falls within that term, but also how we engage males and the spectrum of gender in that topic. And so I'm not going to take up, because we could take up all the time here, but that's something that is on the McNulty Institute's in its mission, and something that we want to be really careful about making sure we are continuing the dialogue on.
You're right, there's a lot more we could go into, and we will get back to that. So Claire, what are some of the ways in which we can disengage in our bias? We've been talking about all the ways in which we can recognize it, and this is, you're talking from a personal standpoint. Once we admit, we buy these two definitions, we admit that we've got bias, what do we do about it?
So interesting, because I have to constantly remind myself about my own bias, because I think we all understand that each of us, it's inherent in each of us. We all have unconscious bias or implicit bias. And how I think also as women we tend, and this is a generalization, but we tend to go to avoidance, right? We don't want to create conflict. We don't want to make other people feel awkward. And part of addressing implicit bias is getting more comfortable with, not necessarily conflict, with getting outside of your comfort zone, asking questions, being a little bit more comfortable with being awkward. And I forget sometimes, like for example, with my own name, when people read that Claire Bruno is going to be someplace, they don't really expect someone who's Vietnamese and Italian who speaks Spanish, right? And then when I start to speak Spanish, they're like, oh, are you from Spain? I'm like, no, there are, I think, just preconceived notions just by reading my name. But if you broke it down, my husband is Italian, my mom is Vietnamese, and the French were there, so there's a lot of French influence. But I often remind myself, just with my name, people are making assumptions about who I am, and that's really important to me to keep that in mind when I'm evaluating students, and especially when it comes to a selective institution like Villanova, like Penn. You make automatic assumptions about somebody based on where they went to school, the fact that this is a self-selective process, women versus men, the type of major that you have, and you really have to take a moment to step back and assess your own assumption. Own the fact that your assumption is specifically yours and might not be shared or be representative of a larger interpretation. And so that's sometimes really hard to do, because we just tend to get very siloed in a lot of ways. I know I do in the work that I have here, and we're also very busy as well. And so I have to remind myself every day, and I encourage you to take a moment, as you're making a decision, as you are making an assumption, take a moment, take a step back, and reassess why you're making that judgment. And I was looking at Terry's books here, because Howard Ross, if you get a moment to see his TED Talk, how does he put it? Constructive uncertainty.
That's right.
So constructive uncertainty, and what that basically means is be okay with pushing back on assumptions and the experiences that you have, that it's okay to come back to something that you think might be a product of your experiences, and push back a little bit on that, and be okay with the fact that sometimes we're going to make decisions based on incomplete information. That's just our limitations in terms of what our brains can process. And so I think we have to find a comfort level with that level of discomfort, because I know I am OCD. I like to feel like I'm in control of things, details. In fact, I'm going to Australia for 2 weeks, and I'm going to take pictures of my stove and my garage door to know that I've closed them. But my point here is that I'd like to have full information when I am thinking about things that I'm doing. And I really take my job very seriously, because the people that I allow into our program are going to be representative and ambassadors of our program. And I want to make sure that I'm making those decisions in the best light possible. And that's really incumbent upon me then to take a step back from being the sum of my experiences, and make sure that I'm really looking at the information and at the person in the most effective way.
Thank you. Well, can we really follow up on some of the things I think that was sort of implicit in all that you say, is that clearly implicit bias is a norm in our world. So how do we, and yet we have to continue, and oftentimes we have to continue in the positions that we're in, which are not always necessarily power positions. How, and I was starting with this with Arante, but how is it that as women we not only get people to recognize their bias, but to begin to really enter into that conversation?
I recently took the liberty of sharing a few articles with my department chair. Just not because he's particularly biased, but that I wanted to be aware of the prevalence of bias and its negative impact. And bias across lots of spaces and ways. And so I think part of it is just educating people.
Okay.
So bias is not easy to correct, but if you know it's happening, then you can adjust for it, right? And you can make preparations to reduce its impact.
And I think to Arante's point, that for as a person who is often doing equity training, one of the things that I found really helpful about implicit bias is that it's a natural function of the human brain because of the incomplete information that Claire was referring to, that if we had to figure out everything about Claire and Arante and Terry every time I met them, or just meeting them on the street, we wouldn't be able to function, right? Hence the Pat skit. But that, in a way, gives us the opportunity to open the door to the discussion, because it's a natural human function, it's how our brains move. But the temptation could also be to let it then be an excuse, right? Because, well, it's just how our brains function, so we wouldn't be able to do it. But what we know as the science is coming out about this is that there are certain situations where implicit bias becomes more prevalent, right? And that is, and Claire was alluding to this a little bit, and when we're making decisions in a fast-paced or high-stress environment, and those are the times where you have to take a step back and say, give me a little space to make the decision, so I know that I'm not doing it in a biased manner, and if possible, to reduce the stress. Not always possible, and which is why you hear in healthcare, implicit bias is really important, because when you're giving care, you're having to make these high stress, immediate decision making. So teaching them that tool of taking the stop is really important. And so that, and if possible, and Claire probably knows this enough, where you can take out the actual identity or shift the any other situation. And so where you can de-identify, which gets difficult because they say, but I need to know how I interact with Terry, so I need to know her name. But putting in place processes that take away some of those identifiers that have the most powerful implicit biases in our culture is something that could be helpful to do that. Or if you can't do that, take a moment internally and shift it and say, now, is that Terry with a female Terry or a male Terry? Because Terry and I have a different experience, because we have names that can, not so much the I, but with the Y for sure, you could be, people could perceive it as a masculine name, and therefore, and
that was done intentionally.
Right, and I think and I've actually had that every once in a while, where somebody will, oh wait, you're Terry. Okay, you're Terry. Yes, that's what I knew. Totally. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's so important, because what you're beginning to talk about is not just that bias exists, but as you're beginning to talk about these solutions, you're actually talking about really putting bias checks into the structure of what we're doing. And I guess one of the things I would want to want us to think about a little bit is, how is implicit bias maybe within the very jobs that we have, or within the structures in which we operate? Can you give some examples and ways in which we can identify and work around it?
I can identify them. I'm still working around them. I mean, one of the things that I think is important, and I'm still getting used to this, is feedback is really important. I encourage it from my staff, which happens to be skew heavily male, and encourage it to give it and to receive it myself, because there are a lot of things when it comes to admissions where we use a lot of generic terms in order to market the program, right? We talk a lot about fit. Are you the right fit for Villanova? What does that mean? How do we define that? And what are we trying to convey when I say fit? So it's really important to me and my team that we define that in a way that is inclusive. And I think even more sensitive about it, again, being some of my own experiences, and I'll share. Whenever I go to my cousins who are strictly Vietnamese, I am probably the tallest and the fluffiest person walking into that room, and because they generally tend to be smaller, and it's just interesting to me that environment and perception and my own implicit bias when I go to a family event, I use those experiences and that discomfort and that trying to understand that when I see someone coming into our program and they ask me about our environment, both inside the classroom, what are the opportunities here, I really try to get a sense of what that means to them, because when I think of fit, it's always inclusion. We want people to be successful here, and success means different things for different people. And eventually, not that I'm doing a plug because she's sitting right here, but Dean Russell has really been instrumental in supporting some of the things that I think are important to us. And when you have that support from the top down, again, another plug here, it makes it easier then to discuss some of these things that we might not want to discuss or might not want to acknowledge that are happening here in our own community. I think I've gone off track here a little bit.
But that's okay. But can we, because I really wanted this conversation to think about the ways in which women might not have full access. We always talk about that everybody is equal in the organization. Everybody has a fair shot. And yet we sit back and we go, And that's really what I want you to talk about.
That's what it's, the imposter theory. Like sometimes we think I'm not supposed to be here. They're going to figure out that I am not the best person for the job, or I don't think about that. And that's one of the things that I think about when I'm talking with women, and who are especially women. Women tend not to go into MBA programs for a variety of reasons. Whether they're afraid of quant, whether it coincides with the personal inflection point in their life, whether or not they can't think they can succeed. And I think part of that is the imposter theory, and as well as we need to make it very clear that women can do anything they want. I think that's why Wonder Woman really resonated with a lot of people, that film, because it really showed women that, superheroes aren't just men who show up in tights or put on a mask and glasses, but that as women, we have access to a lot of different things. And I think we need to, Madeleine Albright said this, and I firmly believe it because I've been in a lot of situations where women don't necessarily help women. And we really do need to support each other. We, especially in higher ed, where we're so heavily represented, it is really incumbent upon us to make sure that we are supporting each other in the best way that we can.
So, according to a large accrediting body, about 30% of business faculty are female, right? Opposed to half of the population. So 30% of the business school faculty is female. Across, generally speaking, but only 20% of the full professors are female. So as we rise in rank, we're less common.
That's just happenstance.
It just
You don't want to move up.
Anyway, but I recently read an article in the Harvard Business Review that talked about women and men and their interactions in the workplace and all these assumptions we have. It's presumed or overtly stated that women might not have as many interactions, might interact differently, might not have as much social capital. So these scientists applied motion sensors and lapel cameras to both men and women in the workplace. And what they found was that as women, we are as social, we interact in the same way, the same number and types of people. So it's not us, right? So we aren't the ones who are responsible for this differential in success and in promotion. It's the way we're being perceived, right? So these biases come to play, and they come to play in a way that keeps us artificially demoted relative to our colleagues.
And, as I'm thinking about this, and maybe you could respond to this too, there also, we've been talking about the implicit biases that are out there, but we also can some biases that we have internally. And I was wondering if maybe when you think about women and even moving up the ladder, some of the things that we have internalized that might also be working against us. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
I think we're socialized to interact differently and to believe differently at work. This morning, I made a very conscientious choice to be my full self at this panel. I could have pulled my hair back. I could have worn a less colorful blouse, right? But I opted to bring my full self, knowing that my first instinct was one I was socialized to, that I'm supposed to look a certain way in order to fill a certain space. And I think as women, we, not just our appearances, but our appearance, our behavior, our interaction with colleagues, male and female, with our students and prospective and current, right, with our superiors. All these interactions are nuanced with what we think society expects of us. And even if we don't want to buy into it, I think we often do in some small parts. And those small parts of us kind of lead to reduced confidence sometimes in behaviors that we would not embody if we stepped aside and became and acted on our full actualized selves.
And I think to your point and to Claire's as well, that we tend to think am I a leader? Am I right for that position, or am I right for this field? And I've done a lot of work with women, getting more women into non-traditional fields. And one of the things that we tend to often think about is, jobs and careers have gender, just like other aspects of our society. So when you say nurse, you think woman. When you say engineer, for the most part, you think man, right? And so because of that, when you think leader, when you think, am I right for this job, you have biases that could be potentially holding you back, but also you should be thinking about, and others should also be thinking about, how the cumulative impact of all of the biases that you've been experiencing are impacting your own decisions or not, to kind of move into those opportunities for ourselves.
One last sort of go-around question before we go to the audience. We've talked a lot about our current state. In higher ed, one of the great things is that we get to touch the future because of the young people who sit in front of us and beside us. How can we better prepare the next generation of men and women to become more aware of and willing to address their biases?
We have to see these people in the roles that we want, in aspirant roles.
Talk about that, please.
There's a shortage of women on boards, executive boards. There are a shortage of women in C-suite leadership positions. There are a shortage of women. We actually have here at Villanova, I think, a nice representation of women, female deans, but that's not true across the nation. And we need to show men and women. They need to see people in those roles. If you want people to associate you with leadership, with being in a power position, we need to have women represented in those roles, because it's the easiest way for folks to connect to a path there. We also have to, and path is a good way of talking about it too. We have to be able to show people the path to get to these places. And I think sometimes that's ambiguous for especially young women. They don't really understand how they're going to get from this place to this place. And I think one of the things that is important for us to do is seed planting. Get at women, get at kids before they start these preconceived notions, and share with them these opportunities that they might have, regardless of whether you're male or female or quantitatively focused or more qualitative. Education is the key in getting to people early, so we can dispel some of these preconceived notions that they might see in the media, that they might be reinforced generationally with parents. I mean, some of us, like my parents are a very traditional couple, but they are very progressive in the sense that I can do anything I want. They don't really understand what I do now, but they are extremely supportive of my right to do it.
And probably very proud.
They are, I have to admit. But I do think that that's really important, is education and doing it as early as we can.
I think we're all better off for being made aware of our own biases. So if we start by having young people or students take an assessment, so you just know what your biases are, and without judgment. It's not, because it's a natural occurrence, right? But these are your biases. And if you think about that in culmination, how that affects everyone in this classroom, when you're talking about the student interaction, you get a different kind of growth. So you couple that with what I want to say is intentional diversification of groups in the business school, or and not diversification racially, but in terms of gender and race and majors. If you're having them talk to people who are unlike them, they can see past the demographics and see to the people. And once you see to the person, then you stop having to make these judgment calls, and you begin to realize that maybe your bias is based on an untrue stereotype. Maybe the things you've been taught to believe your entire life are fallacy, and these types of people can be any number of things, and you grow and expand your beliefs.
You know, that sounds surprising like intergroup dialogue. I'll do that right now.
Well, actually, I really liked the Check Your Blind Spots activity that happened here on campus. And for those of you who weren't here last week, Terry's office sponsored a Check Your Blind Spots event where they came and took. And if you haven't taken it, everybody can go online and take the IAT from Harvard, which is the, and if you just Google IAT
If
Harvard.
if you
Against my
Google, in fact,
students.
Project Implicit.
Yes.
Project Implicit, thank
Right.
you.
There's a great video.
But if you go, it's actually really great because it gets back to that science aspect of it, and you can start to see yourself, check your own biases, check your, where am I, because what's hard about it, and what we haven't talked about because we put those definitions up, is that the implicit and the unconscious part is something that makes this the most challenging. But the good news is, and research bears this out, is that awareness, so moving it from unconscious to conscious, right, implicit to explicit, is the first step and the most effective step. It doesn't cure it, but it's one of the most effective steps to addressing it in some way. And so, once you're aware, then you can start moving on it. And so I love exercises like that help build awareness, and then you can start changing culture around it and understanding the cumulative effect of it, which may have which by the time people get to a place like Villanova, they've experienced a cumulative effect of those implicit biases and are already going, wait a minute, which is part of what Claire's point is in getting them young. Right?
Absolutely. And may I say, one of the interesting things about this 64-foot trailer with individual stations that you could have checked your blind spot is that usually when we think of this, we think of race and we think of gender. And on that bus, they had a little bit of everything. One of the ones I found particularly interesting was color bias. That a lot of times we think of, well, there's black and white, but within that we have different shades, and that was very interesting. They had age was another one, religion, and it was really interesting for me because I was there for the entire time that it was there, just watching people come out, just sort of shaken, saying, "That's not what I thought I believed."
Right. And I think the reason that looking at the full spectrum of biases is really important is because there can be so much sensitivity, particularly in today's society and culture, around race or and even gender to some extent, everything that's happening right now around sexual harassment, etc., that putting it in what seemingly innocuous terms of, is it about something like eye color, right, which is the famous exercise, the brown eyes, blue eyes exercise, puts it in a way that kind of takes away some of our immediate feelings and fear of addressing it. And then once you start with that discussion, then you can extrapolate that to the more painful and impactful issues of race or ability or gender and those things that our culture is really sensitive about but doesn't know how to address because we're so sensitive about it, right?
I'm looking up. Is that it, or can I take just a couple questions? Couple questions from the floor. Please. Can you tell us who you are, too?
If anybody, I've talked all day, I'm sorry. I'm Joanne Garvin, class of 98 engineer, and in a C-suite role, so I've somehow gotten through all this crap. But I will tell you personally, I come from a very poor family. I went to Villanova. I almost didn't come to Villanova because when I put it out to my guidance counselor in my poor town that, hey, I'm going to go to Villanova, the immediate reaction was, you're too poor. Go to community college, then go to Rutgers, it's going to be free for you, blah, blah, blah. And it was like, I think you said your mom and dad were like, do whatever the heck you want to do. That's my mom was. So how income level, economic status is a much, it crosses all lines, gender, race, every religion, everything. And it is a huge inhibitor. So how do you identify that bias? And more importantly, if we are going to get to the young people that are in that situation, how do you coach them out of it? Other than just being lucky and having a parent that's like, don't worry about that, just do.
Can I answer part A and leave part B for everyone else? I had a really embarrassing experience in the classroom, right? I had bought into this Villanova wealth expectation, right? I thought everyone who was in my classroom was from a certain level of wealth. And I said something, and afterwards, a student pulled me aside and mentioned that, we are not all from this kind of background. And in that moment, my embarrassment was visible, right? But what it did for me was it forced me to see my students as individuals versus as a whole. And that causes me to use different examples, to choose different textbooks, and to be mindful of the financial implications of my choices in the classroom, right? So I think sometimes it takes a bit of a jarring moment to make you open your eyes and see the differences in that space. Because unlike other bases for bias, you can't see wealth the way you can see color or gender. So it's complicated.
It's interesting too because it's still to this day, like just making the statement, I come from a poor family, sounds like I shouldn't say it out loud. It's like it's not personal, it was just a fact.
No, but we tend to, in our culture, relate income to merit, right? Which it's not, right? There's a lot more that doesn't. So like you're saying, it had nothing to do with you, what your income status was as a child, or in a lot of ways, even as an adult, but we tend to think that it is, and so immediately it's like, poor's bad, Mm-hmm. And we imply that it's something that you've done to get there.
How do you coach the youth
Yeah.
through that?
Yeah, we have done a lot of work around this, and actually Rante's class has really helped sort of break that down a little bit. I think it goes back to the institutional perception and bias versus what Arante was alluding to there, that we have to break it down as individuals, right? It can't just be Villanova and that's what everybody sees. I think people don't understand that there are food insecurity issues here on campus. People don't want to come into this building because they don't feel like they're dressed appropriately. And I think that when there's actually a very interesting exercise, which event that I wish more people went to. It's called the Diversity Skits, and what it is it's based on true stories that have happened here on campus, and it's very powerful to watch a very jarring moment be acted out in front of you, knowing that it probably happened just outside of this building. And you really do break it down from the institution to the individual, and you realize not only that these are individuals, but they're young individuals, and they still have time, and this is part of our job as educators, to help mold and shape the experiences they have from this point on. So I think it's really important for us to provide more opportunities for each of us, both faculty, staff, students, to hear individual stories, to really stay connected to who actually makes up our community. And it's also incumbent upon me, as someone who is letting people into the program, that I'm understanding who wants to come in here, why, how I can make our education more accessible to people. So I think that that's a really important point, that we have to understand that we are the sum of the individuals that make up our community, and that's something we always have to keep in mind as we move forward and as we evolve as an institution.
And unfortunately, that's the end of our time. But interestingly, we have the director-producer of the Diversity Skits standing right in the back, Mr. Hezekiah Lewis. He could certainly tell you more about that. And in some ways, that is a wonderful note to end on, because what that does is that oftentimes there's a great deal of pushback on that. And one of the pieces of the definition is that it's not easy to change bias. That even when it's acknowledged, even when we call it out, it's a very difficult thing to do. And coming to this panel perhaps has made some of you irate, perhaps it's confirmed some ideas, but what we hope that we've done is that we've encouraged you to think more about this fascinating topic. I have two visual aids. These are very well worn. One is Everyday Bias by Howard J. Ross, and Blind Spot, which is the book Banaji, can't quite do her first name, who is behind the implicit attitude test at Harvard. And this is very readable and really will give you a good idea of what everybody's talking about. And I thank you for coming and encourage you to check your blind spots.